So hello everybody, just about time to start with this new speech. I see someone who was already here this morning, I think, okay, so you enjoyed it, okay. Part of what I will say is connected to what I explained this morning, part of it is new, and part of it is about what I will be talking about tomorrow morning, not here, but in the digital hub. And that's about PDF production in the end. Today's seminar is called The Gamut Riddle and How to Solve It. You all know, as printers, that we always have a problem of... oh, hello again. We always have a problem of going out to press or printing, whatever it is, with the widest possible gamut. Only sometimes it's not possible. And we have to deal with the limitations of the output conditions we have. So this seminar is about this problem, and I will try to give you some hints on how things can be actually handled in this case. Okay, so my name is Marco Livotto. I was trained as a physicist and I work in the field of color correction. I deal with static images, so it's basically color correction in Photoshop. And I was a student, I'm with Dan Margulies, who actually was the man who invented color correction in Photoshop. And other than being a producer of images, I teach, write for a magazine in Italy, and I'm a consultant of several companies as well. If any of you speaks Italian, at the link shown you can find resources on what I did, about 40 hours of video courses on color correction and the environment of color correction. So, since we are talking about gamut, let me try to explain what gamut is, because it's an easy concept to grasp, but it's often misunderstood. You know that we are working with color spaces, and different kinds of color spaces come to that, like RGB, like CMYK, and the likes. A color space is a, well, mathematical entity in the end, and you can imagine that as a volume in a certain colored space, all right? And so a color space can be compared to another, exactly like you compare, say, a sphere to a cube. And we may choose, for instance, the cube as a reference, and then we can check the extension of the sphere. And what we have is a mapping of the color space inside a bigger one. So what I call the footprint of the color space inside a given reference color space, which I can tell you is very often taken, but not exclusively, as being the LAB space, is called the gamut. But maybe an image will clarify this. So this is a geometrical representation of a sort of cube that is the gamut of the LAB color space. LAB color space has an incredibly wide gamut. Some of the colors inside LAB can't be seen, can't be represented by any device. Some are purely imaginary in a way. And it is probably the largest, or one of the largest color spaces we have, so it's a good reference when we need to measure anything else. And this is, in the same scale and the same perspective as the previous slide, what is called sRGB, which is one of the standard RGB color spaces. You're probably aware of that. So you see, it has a much smaller gamut. Gamut meant as the set of colors available in this color space to paint our final results, all right? And also bear in mind that every output device, like a monitor or a printer, has a given gamut because it is described by a color space and a color profile, of course. So in this slide you can see sRGB embedded inside LAB, and I think this representation can clearly show that some of the colors in LAB cannot be obtained in sRGB, nor in any other space, by the way. So now let's change view, let's change perspective and scale, and take this as Adobe RGB's gamut, which is another standard RGB space, all right? I remind you, this is not the same representation as before. I mean, I changed the magnification, basically. And in the next slide, I am going to switch to the representation of sRGB in this scale. And I would like you to have a look at what happens to the greens and the magentas. This is sRGB, so it's a much smaller color space. It's big slice of greens. Let me go back. You have a lot more greens in Adobe RGB and a lot more reds and magentas than in sRGB, which means that if you're working in sRGB, you have a smaller, more limited palette to paint with. All right. Now, if you compare Adobe RGB, which is of course the bigger mesh, and sRGB's gamut, this makes clear the difference between them. Okay? So, to wade through all these, to come through the forest, we need color management, which is a scientific approach to color consistency in the end. And we can define it as a series of techniques and rules that are very solidly based on theoretical basis that guarantee that the color you reproduce remains coherent through the workflow. Of course, if the output color space has enough colors. If the gamut is still limited, then it's a hopeless battle, and we need to find ways to work around that. Color management dictates the rules by which an image is converted from one color space to another, and this is very important because we can sort of change the rules a bit and try to achieve the best from the conversions we need to make. Okay? In color conversion, what happens is that the images that make up the number actually change, but the way you see the image, the perceived color, will not change, of course, unless there is a gamut problem. So I would like to show you an example, which is quite an extreme example. Before I go into this, let me launch an application available on the Mac, which is called ColorSync Utility. You maybe know it. This is a very simple way to see and represent a gamut, a color space, a color profile in 3D. You're looking at Adobe RGB, and let's take a generic CMYK profile, and you see it's a lot smaller, okay? One of the interesting things, if you want, is that if you take, say, sRGB, and use this function that allows you to keep the mesh as a comparison, and then you use CMYK, you see that CMYK is not contained inside sRGB. The relationship between the color spaces is quite complex. This means, in a nutshell, that there are colors in CMYK that you cannot reproduce in sRGB. And of course, there are colors in sRGB that cannot be reproduced in CMYK. Okay? So it's a very complex relationship. And please try to remember this graph, or we'll see it again, because I need to talk about rendering intents in a while. And they will change the way that we try to squeeze the out-of-gamut colors inside the final color space, if it is possible. All right? I want to show you, well, sRGB is probably, well, it's not probably, it is the smallest color space between the standards. It doesn't have a big gamut, but still, I don't know how the projector will react to this picture. It is capable to represent bright colors like this one. This is an amazing picture. It was taken under fluorescent light by a photographer. It's a friend of mine in Italy who is specialized in taking pictures inside discotheques. So you can imagine the lighting conditions. And what I find very interesting in this picture is that if you zoom very closely, you can see that there is a lot of variation. Well, it's a bit tamed on the screen, but you can see variation in the body of the motorcycle, okay? So it's very colorful and very varied. By variation, I'll point it to you, I mean that you can notice this arc of circle being different from the inside, for instance, and from the outside as well. Now, I think that if we were to print this in pure CMYK, we would have a problem, slight problem, because CMYK is horrible at dealing with brilliant blues and brilliant greens, and this is what we have here. Well, actually it's more violet than blue, but just for the sake of testing, let's try to see if there is any out-of-gamut color in this picture with respect to CMYK, of course. So the first thing we must do is check that proof setup is set on working CMYK, or if we want to use a custom profile, just choose one. But if it's set to working CMYK, remember that you are proofing in the space that is defined in the color settings, which in my case is a standard coated Fogra 39 that is more or less a standard profile for one of the many variations of a standard profile for output conditions in Europe for printing on coated paper, blah, no problem. Now, we use a very blunt instrument which is not very informative but can be scary at times, like in this case, which is gamut warning. As soon as I turn on the gamut warning, you will see that part of the image, if there's a gamut problem of course, will turn gray. Well, it could be any color, you can set it in Photoshop, but this is what happens. So I think that we suspect that we have a gamut problem, a slight one, okay? Why did I say this is a blunt instrument? Because it tells you you have a problem, but it gives you no hint of how extended the problem is. Because if you have a color that is just tiny, slightly out of gamut, so little that you wouldn't probably notice it when you go to print, then you will have this kind of behavior anyway, but probably the problem is irrelevant. So we need to make a step forward, remove the gamut warning, and try to use proof colors. Proof colors will give you a preview of what happens when you go to press without actually converting anything. So it's not damaging, it's not destructing the image in any way. Now, let's go close. I'll just use the shortcut, which is Command Y on the Mac. This is the original sRGB, and this is what happens when you go to CMYK, okay? The problem that I see is that the color is lost, and we have to deal with that. Unless we are able to produce print out with the fifth or sixth or seventh color, whatever it is, as we deal with process colors, see cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. There's nothing we can do about the color. But the most amazing thing is that this wealth of variation you have, and it's even more on my monitor, goes completely away. You see, there are areas like this one that were of a different color, and as soon as I go to press, basically, they disappear. This is a case of extreme posterization, of course. And this is what I call the gamut riddle. When we are facing an image like this, what kind of choices do we have? It's not an easy task. And so I'll show you a few of the options that you have. By the way, the fact that I am simulating CMYK output doesn't change. If you have another different profile, even an RGB profile feeding a desktop printer, or any kind of weird profile for a textile machine, this is going to behave exactly the same. And by the way, I'm not showing that, but in the print window of Photoshop, you have basically the same functions, and you can check if you have out-of-gamut colors and have a preview, and even more refined than the one I showed you. So back to the slides and recap. What do we have to check the problem? In Photoshop, the gamut warning, which is what turns your image to gray, and the proof colors, which is an emulation, so-called also a soft proof, while it's not properly a soft proof, but let's call it so, of what's going to happen. That is, let me see on the screen a simulation of what will happen when the ink hits the paper. Notice, remember to check your proof setup, because if you change that, you are actually changing the output conditions of the simulation. What can we do to work around the problem? Option number one, do absolutely nothing. Simply accept that the image will not print properly and accept that we're going to have a flat, lifeless result, both in terms of colors and in terms of contrast, because the posterization brings away the variation, which is the worst thing that can happen to an image. Because if we want an image to be vibrant, to be three-dimensional in a way, we desperately need variation in the image, because that's how our viewing system cues the illusion of looking at something three-dimensional. The second thing is a bit more delicate, and it is not always the cure, but it can happen, it can help, especially if you have a situation where you're out of game mode, but not desperately out of game mode as I've shown, okay? And so it's just about time to talk about rendering intents. Let me show you where they are first. Probably the beginners, if they want to translate this file into CMYK, we are in RGB now, go this way, CMYK color. And at that point, Photoshop warns you that this is probably not what you're likely to do and blah, blah, blah. Maybe yes, but remember that the correct way to do it, the command is there just for the sake of backwards compatibility. Today, it should be really going convert to profile and choose your own profile, which can be, like working CMYK, for instance, and move your image to CMYK using a given profile, which can be chosen among many. And I hope to show you a few later. Okay, this is the basic window. Sorry, that was the advanced window. But even in the basic window that you're probably more accustomed to, you have these four different choices about what is called intent. Well, rendering intent is not one of the most understood things in color practice. So let me try to explain how it works. Now, good news first. You can forget about two. I don't think you will ever need saturation, and probably you'll never need absolute colorimetric, known also as ABSCOL, because saturation attempts to give you the maximum saturation possible and doesn't care at all about luminosity. So, as someone joking used to say, it's good for printing PowerPoint presentations and nothing else, which is not probably what we are into, all right? So drop saturation. Absolute colorimetric, I won't get into that, but it's useful if you are into measuring things, but not very useful for conversions. So we are left with two different choices, that is relative colorimetric and perceptual. I'll tell you, pre-press people like relative colorimetric. Photographers like perceptual. They always argue. In fact, they are different. To try and understand what happens, let's go back to the ColorSync application. Remember, the white mesh is sRGB, the colored mesh is CMYK. One thing to be remembered is that we are looking at the whole RGB space, but a picture in general will not cover the full space. Extreme case, imagine a grayscale picture coded in RGB. Its gamut is incredibly small, so there is no problem. As long as the colors are inside the CMYK gamut, what happens when you go convert to profile is that Photoshop will read the RGB numbers, translate them into LAB, and from LAB translate them back to CMYK. All right? The real problem is born when you're trying to convert a color that is more or less here, so outside the CMYK gamut, which has to be mapped back inside. The mathematics behind this is horribly complex, so I'll try to give you an idea with my hands. Imagine that CMYK is a box and your image is a sponge. If the sponge is smaller than the box, it will fit inside the box, no problem, and whatever you do to the conversion, the colors will remain the same. Okay? Now, if the sponge is larger than the box, you have two ways to make it fit. The first one is trim around the sponge and remove everything that stays outside. But those are colors. What happens to them? Actually, they are packed to the surface and everything is posterized in the end because different colors become one. And that's the most intense color that you can express in CMYK in that chromatic area and so on. This is what relative colorimetric does. The second one is perceptual, and the idea is that you do not trim the sponge, but simply squeeze it so that it fits inside the box. As soon as you release the sponge, it will expand, and that's fine because we haven't killed any color. But the problem is that the whole sponge has shrinked, which means that even the in-gamut colors were desaturated, you know? So if you have a red here and it's out of gamut, and a red here that is not out of gamut, relative colorimetric, and the gamut border is more or less here, relative colorimetric will go like this. The out of gamut color is mapped so that it goes into gamut, and this is untouched. But the other one, when you squeeze the sponge, goes like this. So this is desaturated, maybe a tiny bit, maybe a huge bit, but. So now you see why graphic people working in prepress like relative colorimetric say, I don't care about clipped colors, just keep the colors that I can keep as faithful as possible. Photographers are a bit more delicate and they want to squeeze everything so that no color is lost. And they accept to have a kind of a saturation in the inner colors so that the whole image is preserved. All right? Now, the real question is, does this really make a difference? Let's see. Now, what I'm trying to do is, what I will do, duplicate the image, not the layer. I'm actually working on two copies of the same file, and I'll convert the first one to CMYK standard conversion by using the relative colorimetric, and then do the same with the perceptual intent and see if there's any difference, if there's an improvement. All right. Convert to profile here. Let me check foreground 39. Let's go basic. Okay. Relative colorimetric, this one. Bye-bye to the colors. And edit. Convert to profile, same conditions, perceptual, and we go like this. Now I will do something like copy and paste this one on top and go very close to see if there's any different. I remember this is the second one I did, so this is perceptual. And just to make sure, remember that perceptual is squeezing the sponge, not trimming it. So I expect to have less saturated colors here, but more variation and detail. Let's see if it's true. To a small extent, it is true. Okay? It doesn't change that much. Okay? I don't know if you can see that on stage. I wouldn't consider in an image like this the difference to be extremely critical in this case. All right. Let me give you the bad news now. There are 4 rendering intents defined. How they are implemented inside the profiles is a matter of potluck. I mean, I have seen with my eyes color profiles that behave in relative colorimetric as they should in perceptual, and in saturation as they should in absolute colorimetric. So it's not very well defined. It depends on who actually does the profile with which software and so on. So my suggestion is, there is no strict rule, but the common sense now is that relative colorimetric is probably the best choice. Also because if you have an image like this, trying to save it by going perceptual is like trying to save someone who is dying with a small band, you know, like it's not a cure, it's a palliative in a way. So my suggestion is, if you're not really knowing your profiles and what you're doing, stick to relative colorimetric, because we have a second option. Well, actually, not a second, not a third, but a fourth option. Yeah. And another option is that we may use an output device with a larger gamut, which opens up a number of questions. What is a device with a larger gamut? Like, for instance, are we going to offset commercial printing like the old times? Are we going digital? Or are maybe we going offset like the old times with the spot color? And how do you make a spot color in Photoshop? Nobody ever remembers how to do that nowadays, only pre-press people. It's not difficult, but it's a delicate thing. You can't really prove it. It's a task, really, for an experienced CMYK practitioner. This is really open to speculation. I've seen digital machines that actually have a larger gamut than CMYK. They have their own profiles, so that could be an option with the pros and cons of digital printing that we all know. You can make small runs. The quality can be extremely good. Sometimes, to have control on certain things, you actually need to go offset. So it's a balance every time. But we won't get into this market kind of strategies because I'm talking about technicalities here. And then, or you can try and use all sorts of tricks in Photoshop, including making a spot color, if you wish, like isolating a blue and try to overprint with a 10% or 15% of Pantone blue, whatever, blue reflex, we like it, you know? To have more vivid blues or greens or whatever you need, okay? A word of warning on that. If you're working on a logo and the company has Pantone C300 as their own color, that's very easy. You go into Illustrator, you pick the right sample in the sampling palette. You actually have to load it. You use that, and when you export to PDF, there will be a spot color automatically working on its own, and it's a solid color, so no surprises, okay? When you're working with images, it's a lot more difficult because you must think that a part of the blue is actually, if we're talking about blue, is actually being printed in CMYK, and you're overprinting some kind of ink. Trying to understand how this will work is extremely complex, and probably you will discover that only when you go on paper. So not even a certified proof is enough. Probably you have to be in front of the machine when the paper comes out. And I'll tell you, say a lot of prayers and hope for the best to have a printer who knows his job. There are a few around who is ready to tweak the inks properly to make your job work. I know that I'm not popular while saying this, but do not trust color management in this case, because what we are talking about cannot really be emulated. There are too many variables at play. I know that this is not popular, but this is my belief. In the press room, this is what happens. All right. So, my final point is that rule number 0 in the game is that you never have a perfect image fit for everything. We are living interesting times because your image can now go out on an enormous number of different media, like traditional offset printing on paper, or it could be on fabric, or it could be digital printing on paper, a completely different process, or it could be on the web, or it could be in an electronic publishing kind of device, it could be on a video, anything, how do you make sure that the color is consistent? Shortest seminar of the week, you can't. To a certain extent, you can't. You have to accept that there are differences, and we hope that they are reasonable. But we must do our best to try and tame the differences. So what you should really have is a well-optimized image for certain output conditions. Take sharpening, for instance. Sharpening, and I mean unsharp masking, is something that differs from output to output. You cannot think of putting a picture on Flickr with the same degree of sharpening that you use in traditional printing. So it's a very complex workflow. But in the end, we must remember that the output conditions to us ultimately mean that there is a gamut waiting for us. All right? This I shown this morning, and is one of my favorite examples because it really goes to the heart of the matter. And I'll tell you, it's a very provocative example. This is my faithful Hewlett-Packard printer. Black and white, has been working for 12 years, never went down once, so it's quite a beast. But suppose that you give me a very colorful image to print and this printer, and you ask me to print the image, okay? The problem is that the output device has the smallest gamut you've ever seen because it can only print small carbon black dots. It doesn't print any gray because it screens, and so what we call gray is an illusion. Yeah? It's an effect coming from the blending of the screen dots and the white of the paper. Change the color of the paper and you don't have white. If the paper is yellowish, then you can't have black and white, you have black and yellowish, no problem. But certainly, we are sure about this, it doesn't print any color. And you give me a fantastically colored image to print on this device. What shall I do? Option number one, sit on the floor, cry my guts out for the rest of my life. You'll never get the print back, and I'll die, probably. Also because until I cry, I can't work, so I'm not making any money, starving, finished. Option number two, optimize the image and make it print in black and white as best as you can. Which one? If you have any other, oh yeah, okay, you can change the printer. Option number three, but suppose you can't. For budget reasons, for technical reasons, because this thing is being printed by someone else and you have no control on that. So what are you going to do? Which one of these solutions is better? Which one yields results? I think it's the second. And of course, this is an extreme case. But if you think about CMYK or textile printing or any way, a printing condition where a gamut is involved, the problem doesn't change at all. Don't be afraid. In 10 years, we will have new printing technologies reaching gamuts that we can't even imagine today, and they will be too small because someone will need to push the boundary. So it's going to be an endless problem. Someday somebody will want to print fireworks on paper. I mean, having the impression that they are true, real fireworks, that brilliant, that saturated. And even the widest gamut that we're going to have will not be enough. So this problem is real. And the solution remains the same. Optimize the image for the output conditions. If you try to force your output device without a chance to change it, to go where it can go, you're going to fail miserably. But if you optimize the image, then you will have a better result than if you didn't do anything. This is my final recommendation, and it works always. Let's make a quick comparison now. This is the picture you've seen a while ago, and it's sRGB. This is the conversion I made first, that's relative colorimetric, with the standard Photograph 39 specs. And this is a newspaper-like kind of specs, which is sort of similar But the real problem is that Fogra 39 allows for 130% of total ink on the paper. And this newspaper profile doesn't even reach 240, which means that you can forget about having deep blacks, okay? And that is a problem, because one of the things that we never think about is that when you say gamut, you instinctively think blues, brilliant greens, saturation. No, even blacks are part of the gamuts. The black ink in CMYK is something that extends the gamut of the CMY space. You have more depth in the shadows. But if you can't use it properly, then you're at a loss. Okay? So the idea is always optimize for the output conditions. Otherwise, you will see horrible differences. Notice some very, very weird things happen. Notice the original image. Please look at the lighter stripes in the background, okay, the violet one, not the red ones. They are more or less maintained in this conversion, but see what happens in this one. They turn deep magenta. Why? I have no idea. But it's such an extreme conversion that a very squeezed profile will do very strange things. So be prepared for this. Because in general, when you're converting, I say to CMYK, but basically to anything, when you're working with a raster image processor, what we call a RIP, you have three possible workflows. The first one is what I call early binding, and it means that you need to convert in Photoshop every one of your image to CMYK in this case, and optimize manually for the output condition. This gives you the best results possible if you know what you're doing, because you have complete and total control. The downside of it, of course, is that it costs a lot more, because you need to allocate 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 10 minutes per image, to say the least. So it's a serious consideration. There is a mixed binding kind of thing. You do not convert in Photoshop, but probably you're going to place your images and artwork in, say, InDesign, and then export a PDF. Okay, if you produce a PDF of a substandard called X1, and I'll talk about this tomorrow at the Digital Hub, this ensures that no RGB files go to the RIP. This is a very delicate point. You can place RGB files in InDesign, and if you export like this, you will force an automatic conversion to CMYK. So who takes care of the conversion? A machine, basically, a program, if you want. But then the RIP doesn't receive any RGB material. Or there is a late binding option. You don't convert anything in Photoshop and produce a subset PDF called X3. This is a completely automated process. You don't have to worry about output profiles, okay? Because the conversion will happen in the RIP. You can send RGB stuff to the RIP and it will be converted. The best example for this, if you don't have a RIP, is your desktop printer. Most of the cases it will be an RGB printer, not in that it contains red, green and blue inks. We know that doesn't work, but it expects RGB food. It expects a file that is encoded in RGB, not CMYK. Once the file is inside the printer, it gets separated by an algorithm that we don't know. Epson uses their own, Canon uses their own, so it's completely out of our control. And this is what happens. We send RGB and the printer takes care of it. While this is the only thing we can honestly do by choosing the right profile for the paper and the inks and so on for our printer, while we print on desktop, it's a bit less scary when you think of high volume digital printing. Because if you have critical images here, who can tell which is the best conversion that we shall do? And I would like to make an example of that now. Before I do that, another word about soft proofing. We said that looking at a monitor should give us an idea of what's going to happen when the ink goes to the paper or the fabric. This is something that I insist on. There is a very widespread misconception that your final output should match your screen, which is the most horrible thing you can think of. It's true to an extent, but put this way, it's a very badly posed problem, and this philosophy is doomed to fail sooner or later. Let me explain why. Because in this case, the model you have is this one. You have an original image, whatever that is on the left, and then you stick it on the monitor, and you see that the colors are right, but maybe it's too light. The luminosity is a bit too high. And then you print it, and you discover that it's reddish and saturated, while the luminosity is so is okay. And the problem, you say, the printer doesn't match my monitor. I'm very sorry to inform you that your monitor doesn't match the original and your printer doesn't match the original, which is completely different. Okay? This is not hard copy, because this philosophy would be like this. Here's my monitor, pick a piece of paper, go like, and it should be identical. It's not a stamp. This is not how it works. The good concept is this one, that there is an original and it goes through to the monitor in a certain direction and to the printer in another direction. What I didn't tell you is that you never see the original. You don't know what it is. You can only see a representation of it. A representation on your monitor and a representation on your printer. Okay? So, the only reasonable thing you can do is try to make sure that both representations are the best possible with respect to an original that you can't see otherwise. Okay? If the printer, and as it's often the case, has a smaller gamut than the monitor, you cannot achieve a hard copy of the monitor. You will have probably the best rendition possible, we hope, of the original in that color space. And the out-of-gamut colors will be gone anyway. So be reasonable in what you ask. Also because in the whole history of the graphic arts and photography in particular, there's never been a request ever that a transparency would match a print. Everybody knew it was a different media, and now we are asking that a backlit display looks like a piece of paper. I can't understand that. It's a completely different physical phenomenon. It's like comparing an apple to a lemon, you know? Yes, both are fruits, but you can say that the apple is bigger in a way because it doesn't make real sense. You can compare to lemons if you wish. So, recap. 3 workflows. Early binding. You convert everything in Photoshop, optimize the images manually by color correction, what we were talking about this morning. And at this point, everything is CMYK, and if you choose so, spot colors in Photoshop. Or you can have a spot color logo in InDesign, I don't care. But the color spaces are CMYK plus additional Pantone or whatever things you can think of. Mixed binding, you don't convert anything in Photoshop or convert only a few images, and some you don't. You can place them in RGB and then you produce a PDF X1. That format forces a conversion to CMYK and spot colors, if there are any, in InDesign. And so you're back to case 1, only you lost control on the images that you didn't touch in CMYK. Late binding, you don't convert anything, produce a PDF X3. And no conversion takes place. RGB remains RGB, and the RIP handles it. How? We don't know. It really depends on several factors. Something that I didn't put in the slides, but it's important. There are 2 more different subsets coming. Well, one is there, it's X4, and X5 is now on the market. Be very careful with those, because they expand on X3, For instance, X4 allows for transparencies. If you have two transparent objects in InDesign, for instance, or even in Photoshop, overlapping, you see something where they interact. But in the PDF X3, that's flattened. It's not two objects, it's just one. And this depends a lot on the settings of flattening, transparency, color space, and so on. If you produce a PDF X4, the transparency is retained. Basically, you have one more channel handling the transparency. Why? Because, of course, when you go to the plate, or whatever kind of printing mechanism you have, the transparency needs to be flattened, but who takes care of that? The RIP. Small problem, some RIPs are not very happy to take a PDF X4. So make sure, before you produce a PDF X4, and even more X5, which is not yet available in InDesign or Photoshop, that the RIP can handle it. Otherwise, it's a recipe for disaster. All right? So my recommendation, if you go late binding, still stick to X3, unless you are 100% absolutely adamant sure that the RIP will handle the X4 protocol. Okay. The bottom line is that mixed binding and late binding are rather easy. One of the problems, let me tell you, is that there aren't so many people experienced in CMYK anymore on the market. Even students coming out of graphic schools, they know that there is CMYK, but they never correct an image in CMYK. So it's one of the disappearing jobs. If you find one and is reliable, you can use it. But in principle, it's very difficult to work in CMYK if you're only used to RGB. If you come from CMYK, it's easier, but be careful. Early binding, which involves having someone who is proficient in CMYK, is the choice for quality. Last year I worked on an art book that contained something like 1,200 images, and we were a team of 4 people, and we did everything in CMYK because we needed absolute control on the colors. It was about a church in Italy. It was an atlas of the church. Can you imagine having 20 different bits of gold that are indeed different but must look more or less the same on the page, which means place them on the page and then open them one by one and go with the curves trying to match them. If you do that in RGB and then convert, it's likely to have shifts. In this case, we were able to do it properly. Even for regular work, you can have control, for instance, over black generation. If you know what it is, I'm sure you do. And you may avoid serious problems. But the problem is that early binding is still more costly. So it's connected to quality, and quality doesn't come for free, usually. Okay? I would like to show you very quickly. Let me just have a show of hands. How many of you were here this morning? Only, okay. So be patient. I'll show you something for those who weren't here. I have 2 images. This one has a gamut problem with the blue jacket, of course. I'll be very quick now because I told you I'm doing basically the same thing that I did before. Gamut warning. Oh yes, we have a problem. How big is the problem? Let's go to the fabric and go Command Y and see how much it posterizes. It's not dramatic on the screen because already the color is a bit clipped in RGB. But believe me, it's horrible if you see it here. Especially in the upper area, you can see a lot of luminosity contrast disappear. Everything is posterized. This is one of the problems that you can find. So if you need to print this properly, probably a 5th color is the way. But if, suppose, you have no other choice than doing CMYK and no spot colors, one of the things that you shouldn't be doing is this. Now, keep proof colors on, and some people think that the best thing to do is to fire up an adjustment layer of hue saturation and change the color blue so that it gets as vivid as possible. It's logical if you think, because we are losing blue, so give me more blue. What I can do is simply click in, it's such a different color than any other color in the picture that I only need to click with the eyedropper, oops, bring it down, just to check that I desaturated it, and I have automatic selection without a mask, basically. Go back to 0, this is -100, and try to saturate even more. I think you see what's happening. Let me go closer. The more you saturate, the flatter it becomes. So this is absolutely the wrong thing to do. If you want to get a better image from this, you must be ready to desaturate the image. The logic behind it is, I've lost the color anyway. Why caring about something that I've lost? It's not there anymore. Let's save the contrast, please. That's the only thing you can do. So, by desaturating the original, you can recover a lot of the shape, at least, of the fabric. That's the only thing you can do in these cases. So, main rule, if you have serious posterization coming from out-of-gamut problems, going from RGB to any other color space for printing, CMYK in this case, desaturate the offending color. Do not rely on rendering intents, because we've seen they are not so performing as we would like. All right? And let me show you a typical case, kind of a fashion shoot. This is a nightmare for anyone to print, because there are only two things that really count in this picture, and that is the coat, which is definitely black, and the face of the model, which is almost white. So this picture almost has no middle tone, no mid-tones, okay? This is an image that would be extremely critical in a late binding kind of workflow, even in a mixed binding workflow, because you should convert this to CMYK in a peculiar way. Let me tell you, suppose that you're going to press with this image. Of course, we would like to see some detail in the coat, which is the real subject of the picture. Suppose that the black ink, as it always does, comes down too heavy. This is disaster. Everything will be cluttered and you won't have any detail in the black. So the print is ruined. Which countermeasure can you do? You can use a variation of the standard foreground profile, if that's the printing condition you're using, called where it is, here, low GCR, which means that this is your cyan channel, this is the magenta, this is the yellow, and this is the black. This is a lighter black than a normal conversion, which means that if something horrible happens with the black ink, it will be less damaging to this. I know that you don't want to hear this, but remember that the best separation you can make is not the one which will print better. It's the one less likely to give you trouble. That's a completely different concept. Of course, it will print well, because there could be a problem. You know, if I put relatively little black on the plate, I need to compensate with other inks. So this separation will have more cyan, more magenta, and more yellow than a regular separation. And you could say, okay, suppose that the magenta ink flows down to heavy. What's going to happen? Oh, well, not much, because it's so dark that you will perceive it as black anyway. If you measure it, it will be slightly violet, but who cares? I will have detail. I'm not talking about strong violet, you know. I'm talking about a relatively small color shift. I personally, I don't know about you, I wouldn't mind seeing a small cast in the coat rather than not having detail at all. And if you're dealing with an image like this, probably the best choice you can do is fire up here a very old adjustment available in Photoshop, which is a selective color correction, which goes back to the days when everything was done by hand. And you can do this. You can target the blacks, that is the dark part of the image. And unfortunately, you don't have control on what blacks is. It's burned into Photoshop's memory, so this is not so selective as you may like. It's an old adjustment, but very useful in this case. And you can remove some color from beyond the black. Let me exaggerate so you can possibly see it on screen. Look, what you're actually doing is this. Let me go to the channels. Okay. This is the cyan channel after the removal. This is the magenta channel with and without removal. And this is the yellow channel with and without removal. Basically, what you're doing, you are removing ink under the black so that the black can print lighter, okay? And this is something that you can't really do in RGB. And this is something that probably no automated program will be ever able to do properly, because a program cannot tell automatically that the coat is the focus of attention. And when you've done this, you have a big, big bonus. I'm sorry, it won't translate on the projector, but I'll show you the maneuver anyway. When you removed everything, not everything, a lot of the color, you can do something that is not very much done anymore, like fire up a curve, select the black channel, and give contrast to the black channel. I think you've seen a difference in the right part, all right? And so you're going to press with a very, very, very light picture that is full of detail and still rather dark, because you still have a relevant ink on the paper. And it can only do you well. That's what I did. There's just two cases of dealing with what indeed is a gamut problem. The first one was a gamut problem with color, and this is avoiding a cluttered gamut problem with the black, okay? There is a joke in a pre-press industry that if you ask a scientist, 6 years old, and a retoucher, what is RGB, LAB, YUV, or whatever, any other color space, the scientist will give you a very theoretical reply. The 6 years old will tell you there are 3-letter words, and the retoucher will say, oh, well, they're all color spaces, but they don't have the black, so to hell with them, because I want CMYK. And this is the proof that I need a black curve to do things properly in CMYK, okay? Most of the time. If you want to know more about this, the marathon goes on tomorrow, 11:30 in Digital Hub. I'll be talking about producing the PDFs for the digital age and basically X1, X3, X4, and we will discuss in detail with examples for the difference. And if you want to know even more, here's my English blog. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to reply, if I may. I don't seem to have any questions. You will write me on the blog. All right. Thank you very much then for your attention.